Hello everyone, today we talk about the Holy Roman Empire and the Italian Communes, a topic that I've already discussed actually a couple of times in detail as such. I mean the real relation, actually the struggle chiefly between the commonalities of the Italic kingdom and the chiefly the German monarchy, obviously becoming the imperial one once it came into Italy to take the crown, and that therefore was at this point in history closely intertwined with whatever was happening in fact in there. And recently we have discussed about communal civilization in its ensemble, in its entirety, and obviously naturally stressing the importance of the Italic communes and their relevance not just for for medieval history, but actually for the whole European Western history and their importance in developing the Renaissance, etc. And that's what they're often recorded for, recalled and remembered for, like saying, all these very wealthy and powerful city-states where the arts, science, and the humanism was born as we know it, and putting the theoretical and ideological grounds for what the idea of modern Europe today was. But I think that an excruciatingly underestimated and overlooked topic is in fact the what happened before. The idea is that the Italian communes become famous around the world in mass culture and in this general appreciation towards the Renaissance Italy, etc. In fact, towards the late Middle Ages, the moment in which even the early modern age, as a matter of fact. So in this period in which communal civilization, in many ways, is still obviously alive, but has naturally been framed now in something more complex than that, in the seigneurial rule and in the formation of in the making of the regional states that would arrive fundamentally intact until the actually contemporary age, and yes, still framed into the Holy Roman Empire. And the great overlooked chapters is their actual institutional relation with the empire, part of which they were. And secondly, the struggle proper and the development of the communal institution into this I was about to say conflict, but it's also reductive, because what we will try to observe today is that also the narrative that this was somewhat a problem, a general that there was a general enmity underlying the relations between the empire and the commonalities, not just into Italy, but chiefly into Italy, because the struggle chiefly with the Swabian dynasty, etc. was all about that. In the other videos we made, I created actually a playlist dedicated to the communal Europe that I think it was useful because it encompasses the whole topic, let's say the whole phenomenon of communal civilization from a European perspective that goes beyond the most the most famous Italian development and chapter that is. It was definitely the major one, but it existed. It existed also in Germany, in places where urbanism actually was not a big much, but still the idea of the commune as a community, in fact, a university, also as these were called sometimes, is something that goes beyond even the Apennine Peninsula. Yet today we will stick to it, because we will try to observe in which historiographical perspectives the struggle between chiefly certain leagues, the Lombard League most of the times, but with during the time during the empire of Frederick I and Frederick II, has been conceived. And we will see now in which terms, because obviously there was a lot of ideology and still remains. Sadly enough, I think in Europe there is this from whichever side that tells a story, there is this kind of factionalism based on kind of modern nationalism that obviously finds very few place in this otherwise very intricate and complex and complicated political scenario that it's because of this it's very overlooked, because it's often treated very badly, in the sense that there is on every manual or something that is kind of general say not even just manualistic level, because certain manuals are even good at this, but even if you find the average disclosure book about the Middle Ages and their story, and even from a military point of view, you find that the communal civilization is treated just at its beginnings, like at a certain point in high medieval Europe, these cities pop out and they're kind of rich, right? They're merchants, that's all what they are. And then at a certain point there are the seigneuries and the Renaissance, and everything laying in the middle is forgotten. And that instead is, by the way, not just the most important, arguably, part of the story, but also even massively the most interesting, also for whoever is interested in military history, overlooking the chapter, I mean, sticking just to what it concerns, I don't know, the northwestern Europe in itself, and basically ignoring all the rest into Central Europe, into Eastern, it's very bad. And that of the Italian Communes is definitely a chapter that is that possibly the chapter that reveals the greatest incongruency, in this sense, that presents with the greatest amount of evidence of material, etc. Let's remember that at this point Italy produced far and by far way more sources than any other place at this time. Their historiography was damn developed at this point. It was a product of the same cities, because every city was kind of independent-minded and told the story from its point of view. So you have tons of evidence in here. Also, all the contempt that generally exists, especially in the northern world, in other countries where at that time historiography was dominated by the clergy, is this contempt towards the chronicle, right? Like a chronicle is just fairy tale. If you look at, and that's a very typical kind of usually British made, but also other type of a stereotypes. The idea that the chronicle is just rubbish or something that, however, just tells gross stories that these guys, the authors, were paid to do. When you look at South, you look at Italy especially, you realize the chronicle is the first and most important and an alarmingly objective, most of the times, source that tells you the story for strongly pragmatic reasons. There were no kings there. The Italian kingdom didn't have a monarchy on its own. That had died out for whichever it had been in its fragmentation at the beginning of the 11th century. What follows later gives way to this much greater and much more solid world that I don't know why it's so forgotten at this point. I mean, if you have a city like Florence that alone had an income of the whole that was superior to the whole kingdom of England, and for not talking about all the other cities that summed together. I mean, at this point, this was a massive macro entity into around which the whole European economy pivoted. And it's gross, in my opinion, how let's leaving aside the Middle Ages, of course, are neglected because people are just dumb about it. But the even looking at within it, let's tell a story of what it was like systemically speaking, structurally speaking. Let's observe how this machine of medieval Europe actually worked, and which were the forces, the dimensions, quantitatively speaking. And these are not chapters you can overlook. This is not a secondary topic that you say, oh well, yeah, I don't care because all I focus about is whatever my country limitedly is. You have to expand necessarily the boundaries, and this is a must know for every medievalist worthy of this name. Otherwise, it's just a joke, but fundamentally. Also because the whole balance of Europe, politically speaking, wasn't there. Was about what the empire was doing with the Italian cities, whether they allowed them to be crowned in Rome, whether they managed to control the peninsula or not. And the whole system, but not just in Europe, also throughout all the Mediterranean, even the Near East, was influenced by that. The consequences, for instance, of the Battle of Legnano is often considered just like a localistic thing, right? It was the Milanese or the Lombards that defeated the Frederick Barbarossa. It was just about them, right? And that is a thing that shattered the whole international set of alliances, of systems. And that is something we're gonna look at partially even today to explain another thing that is, however, not taking into consideration the city-state as it's being considered as such, but as just as a corporative element that was framed into a much broader, more complicated system that just neatly shaped, like the Germans were about feudal stuff and the Italians were about the city-states, and no, absolutely not. There was still approximately for didactic reasons you can even outline such a differentiation, but there was still a lot of things in the middle. Also, feudal Italy is being neglected as much as communal Germany, for instance, and this is these are things that have to be understood, even if there are differences that obviously existed, but as a part of a world that cannot be interpreted through the national mindset, nationally influenced mindset of our days after one millennium of changes of cultural shaping of structuring of states, etc. So it's way different. It's way important. At the same time, there is this broader chunk of Central Europe that, in fact, encompasses both Germany and Italy that are, as the Holy Roman Empire, let's say a world on its own. If you look even beyond the Middle Ages, in spite of the differences, the quite big differences that existed between, north and south of the Alps, you see that Germany and Italy remained until the 18th century. They were known as the weak areas, like the areas that were fundamentally heavily and hopelessly fragmented. Especially Germany, actually, and surprisingly enough, but not so much, because in that sense, communal civilization into Italy had brought to those regional states that more or less had definitely not been able to compact the whole peninsula under just a few states, but nothing in comparison with Germany, where you have more than 1,000 different states, etc. So. And still two different institutional systems that, paradoxically, in Germany was more unitary with the empire, with the German crown, that whatever was still felt somehow and still organized, and, for instance, prevented Germany, perhaps in virtue of this hopeless fragmentation, also partly the fragmentation, the foreign invasion, while Italy was effectively subdued, at least. Certain areas were even directly conquered by foreign entities, but that were a bit the hair of the Holy Roman Empire that at the time was still alive. Until the secularization happened in Napoleonic times, where the Holy Roman Empire formally disappears. But this is just to give a bit of background. The main topic I want to discuss today is, however, about the misunderstandings that occurred in the conception, in fact, of the stories of these developments. I've already addressed this discussing I think I made 2 videos. I made a video on the Battle of Legnano, which was one of the first ones I made. And also I think one video both for each Frederick the First and Frederick the Second against the Lombard League in the respective centuries, that also framed that a little bit. If you go into the medieval Italy playlist, I have created there are several and there is actually I think let me check here with the playlists. Yeah, I made a playlist on the Italian Communes that also explains in some cases, can even give you some indication about that. But here, no, that's not communal Italy, but in medieval Italy for sure. But there is also a playlist on the Holy Roman Empire. Actually, I created many of them. Some of them you find them in one of these playlists if you're interested. They're about Frederick the First and Frederick the Second, so they're relatively easy to find. Even if you type Schwerpunkt on YouTube, Frederick the First, Hohenstaufen, usually that pops out. So, first of all, what were I think the healthiest way to see even those Italian city-states, for instance, another thing I noticed, just in terms of cliches and improper naming, let's say that the few times you find this stuff around, it's all about either the Italian city-states. That's the term. I think the term commune is way more, aside from being historiographically more correct in general, but it's also much more effective to understand what the commune was, and the fact that there weren't really city-states. Yes, okay, these cities were fundamentally political institutions that started within the city and also expanded, however, on the countryside. That is a very important discriminant, because, for example, in what the Italian communes did in this sense, it wasn't done by anyone else. The expansion into the countryside, creating, even subduing the local feudal aristocracy, was something that couldn't happen, for example, in Germany. Or in places in Germany, you had the Freie Reichsstädte that are actually pretty dynamic and pretty well organized, and they remained maintaining prerogatives, but outside the city walls, it's the territorial princes that rule. In Italy, you have the opposite. You have these communes expanding into the countryside and subduing the local lords, which is something that when the Germans arrived in Italy, they were completely puzzled by, because they couldn't conceive that. I mean, it's true in the sense that the Germans were imbued with this very heavy, more than actually feudal. That from Frederick the First especially, that you had French the German feudalism on the French model expanding actually, and taking root, but mostly aristocratic mindset that simply couldn't make them understand how it was possible that a government of commoners could rule over people of noble blood. That was completely inconceivable. And in the clash between the emperors and the Lombard League, what you see most of the times is this cultural, let's say, incomprehensibility. I don't know how to say that. This cultural limit, fundamentally, to understand this reality that had taken roots, had taken origin, especially between since the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century. That was objectively very, very new. Was original. Well, something inconceivable into places like France. I mean northern France and Germany. I'm saying northern France because actually southern France was very similar to Italy under this regard. The Occitan cities were were still something different from the Italian ones, but still a lot was shared. Also culturally speaking, the region of Provence, or Tuscany and Sicily were pretty much in contact one with each other. In southern Italy, this is another thing actually I should mention. When we talk about Italy now, we're not talking about the modern state, we're talking about fundamentally what was part of the Italic kingdom. That is northern and central Italy. That was the empire. That was part of the empire. The boundaries stopped in the south. In the south, it was the Norman kingdom, which was something that eventually even the same Germans come to occupy for dynastic ties, but had a very different institutional situation, because fundamentally it was not part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Germans at one point stressed the fact that since the empire was universal, that had to be encompassed as well. And since especially the papacy was within the Holy Roman Imperial borders proper, and the Normans were fundamentally papal vassals, it kind of consequently appeared that at least even the Kingdom of Sicily was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was just something nominal at best, and it was actually not really ever part, not even later when the boundaries were set, not even when effectively the Habsburgs, but that's another story, because eventually the southern Italy was occupied by the Spanish, and at that point there was still like a part of the Spanish dominions. So even if the Habsburgs came to rule both on Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and in Spain, the divisions remained. So there was never that kind of evolution. It's like with France. France theoretically was part of the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, theoretically, the whole Western Christendom at least was part of the Holy Roman Empire. That it turned out that this was mostly this German thing, with this appendix of Italy and then other parts of Central Europe, but like Burgundy or Bohemia, etc. But okay, let's skip this. But so what was extraordinary of this evolution was that it was happening within the Holy Roman Empire. I think now not many people own these misconceptions, but fundamentally the Italian communes never thought to basically claim that they were not part of the empire. It was like in the 14th century. We'll talk about a few videos. I don't remember which ones. Florence, that was kind of the most republican city, the most let's say, this sense democratic. Actually, it was an oligarchy of merchants, but in fact of merchants that weren't really framed into a feudal mindset. They claimed that basically a city was completely free by definition, because as long as they had held the empires. But we're talking about the 14th century, a moment that we will also have to discuss, where both the empire and the papacy were kind of fading as universal powers. Florence had especially led the resistance at that point against the various emperors that like Henry VII and Ludwig of Wittelsbach. So they had this kind of radical view, but it was actually just an intellectual spark. It was told once, but it's not that Florence even thought to be outside of the empire. Actually, Tuscany was part of the whole Roman Empire. It remained, and even the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was created. The 16th century was a feudal vassal, an imperial fief, imperial vassal. So it's the Italian communes were firmly within the empire, and even in the mindset of the time, nobody really thought to conceive it otherwise. I mean, it was normal that there was an emperor. It wasn't even the interest of this communities to say, okay, well, let's make it be there an authority, someone who makes police, and that theoretically shall give an order, an institutional order and a progress. Now, we all know that this stayed on the at this point, at least in German monarchy, that had managed to monopolize historically for reasons that we have discussed maybe on the Potestas Imperi video we made. Excuse me, on the, also one of the Potestas that discusses partly this, but also on the Renovatio Imperi, actually, I wanted to say. But now it was mostly a German thing, like a German monarchy that in this sense had a sort of proto-national character. Even in the 14th century with Ludwig of Bavaria that we were discussing before, there is this idea that now basically the crowning is somewhat mostly a German business and not anymore a Roman and papal one, but that stemmed from practices and conveniences that had not to do with at all with the put into discussion of the empire as such as an institution. And in fact, the actual requests that were the cause of the eventually of the clash between the Hohenstaufen and the Lombard League stemmed from the fact that the German emperors were asking for rights that were, at least theoretically, their own, into a kingdom that was actually the most important one of the whole empire, because Italy was recognized since the time of Charlemagne as de facto the center of the empire. It was simply the kingdom to which the imperial title was associated, because you couldn't become emperor if you didn't own Italy. Theoretically, now we know that the thing always started from Germany, but if there ever had been, I don't know, I'd say a French emperor, which could, by the way, even happen, because at one point there were even Spanish emperors, with Alfonso of Castilla in the 13th century, it was namely appointed king of the Romans, still not emperor. But even in the early modern period, you have Francis I of France, of Valois, that was basically, it was out, he lost the race for the purchase of the imperial crown, but he could become as king of France, as we were saying before, as a perfectly Christian prince. In that sense, even was siding with the Ottomans at that point against the Habsburgs, Holy Roman Emperor was perfectly possible. So the reasons why, so we when we look at the Italian Communes, we don't have to think that they were expanding into a world that they thought to be completely anarchic, or where they didn't want to bow to anyone. Actually, they agreed that even in their victory after Legnano, or after Frederick the Second's the final defeat, that basically they had some duties as imperial vassals, and it was normal like that. Also because, by the way, the political fragmentation that existed in Italy had naturally created these two factions that are most famously known as Guelphs and Ghibellines. That is basically an Italianization of two different terms, Welfen and and Weibling, and that were respectively the opposite, the family that opposed the most the Hohenstaufen, actually being intertwined with them, and the war cry of the Hohenstaufen from after the castle of their origin. That were, in this sense, respectively pro-papacy theoretically and pro-emperor. Actually, the Guelphs were ideologically way less committed, because actually siding with the papacy didn't mean anything for them. They were actually siding against the emperor, and then they were backed by the papacy, chiefly also by France, against Germany, let's say. Well, the Ghibellines, however, were those who supported the emperor, and usually as lords. So with this mindset that was generally still feudally oriented, or at least some of them were actually like most of the Italian aristocracies at this time were actually coming from the commonalities. I mean, they weren't, were at least very rarely, noblemen of ancient blood. but they retain this the awareness that the role of a leader of a vicary, of an imperial vicary, for instance, was also an imperial vassal, of course, into Italy could give them power, and therefore there was always this competition and race for obtaining the title and siding also with the emperor. And if you look at the balance historically, it's not that these two factions were two parties, let's say better, were ever to were something so well defined, sharply defined. Actually, everything was very fluid, especially towards the 14th century. Now, being Guelph or Ghibelline had actually not lost completely any meaning, but if you look at the alliances that were drawn at the time, they were completely now beyond that. You have Ghibelline leaders even among the papal legates, and you have certain Ghibelline leaders that actually actively fought against sometimes the imperial interference, so even in open arms and defeating their armies. So it's pretty fascinating to look at that history. But it all had a logic. It all had a meaning and an importance. There would be a lot to talk about this, but looking once again at this moment of the origins, what was happening in Italy, that these communes were defining themselves within the urban societies with their own system, with their own laws, with their own magistracies, and that were tendentially independent, even from, in their creation at least, from the imperial authority. This is also particularly important because we have just said that the commune was not autonomous, but the process of institutional development and internal administration organization was largely autonomous, which is actually not an Italian prerogative. It's something that happened all over Europe. The problem is now that the difference, let's say, is that the Italians now were expanding these prerogatives, way more far than had ever been experimented outside of the feudal hierarchy as such. So even in Italy, there had been a feudal hierarchy, and what I want to stress in this video is exactly this point. Now we will get to that. Is that Italy was not in the hands of the communes. I mean, it was largely at one point, definitely, but still, the feudal system never really disappeared. Actually, there was a sort of refeudalization of Italy, in part at least exactly through the formation of the regional states that at that point were trying to conceive themselves, having gotten rid of the main rival cities that had been incorporated in these regional domains, of titles that were similar to, like, think about the Grand Duchy of Milan. It's a title that Milan was not a Grand Duchy. It was born like a city, like all the cities that were in the empire. At this point, the Milanese dynasty obtains that title, which is a feudal title. They paid for it, by the way. This happened at the time of Charles IV of Bohemia, if I'm not wrong. But it's evident that this was a game that satisfied actually both of the authorities, and throughout all the modern period, actually the interaction between the especially the Habsburgs, of course, that represented now, but the modern age, the leading dynasty in Germany, and that had effectively monopolized most completely the imperial title, had actually were pretty much in contact with Italy. There was a lot of cooptation of the Italian elites that participated to the empire, that went fighting into Germany during the 30 Years' War, just like the other way we were talking about Wallenstein. Also in the Spanish army, of course, since part of Italy was actually under Spanish domination at that point. But it was the same Habsburgs, and they were fighting alongside, both Spain and Austria in this, theoretically at least, especially in continental Europe. And the idea is that these connections were pretty strong, and there's a tendency, I would say, I think in modern Europe, especially in I mean not in modern Europe, in today's Europe, to stress. Like it seems to have come back in the 30s, like the differences between the north and the south, as if there's two halves of the, even if you could sum up this differences just in such a simplistic subdivision, that these two halves of Europe are fundamentally like two things that separated differently, as if there were two different civilizations or cultures that never spoke to each other, never did anything in common, and had nothing in common. As a matter of fact, the intersections between, especially countries like Germany, southern Germany chiefly, and Italy, northern Italy, obviously for obvious geographical reasons, but they were actually pretty intense and massive, and kept being kept maintaining this axis. I can't tell you that, I don't know, what happened in World War II, like with Germany and Italy siding, was kind of a product of that, because it's a gross misunderstanding. But there were even some broader strategical dimensions that always made, especially the Central Europeans power like Germany and whoever ruling there, aware that the control of Mediterranean, and or at least the cooperation of whoever inhabited there, was crucial for any kind of operation. So these were things that effectively repeated themselves into history, and actually the fragmentation of Germany and Italy partly instead than hampering this, it actually favored it, because as long as there had been two united powers in Germany and Italy, the most obvious thing was clashing against each other. But with the very high degree of political fragmentation of these two regions, the exchanges were continuous. Even if you look at the trade routes, just take what the main thing about all the connections that existed between, I don't know, an area like Bavaria and Venice, the German quarter in Venice. I mean, it was all like a lot of money actually, and a lot of know-how. Even there would be a lot to tell. Even in armor production, all this stuff. If you're interested into technology, and it's not a surprise actually that Germany and Italy, at the threshold of the modern age, were effectively the most technologically advanced countries out there. And partially thanks to the fragmentation, because bigger states, like if you take France, this was a real state at that point, worth of this name, with a process of statal formation, was most advanced even than England, than other countries that had this kind of monarchical traditions, was very powerful, but was all concentrated. So it didn't focus on quality but on quantity rather. This is a constant in history. Countries like Germany and Italy were chronically fragmented, instead had developed this kind of more qualitative attitude, this idea, and they were the centers of know-how and so these perspectives matters, whatever you want to call them, whatever you want to see them like. They existed, and they were actually very persistent. I mean, they weren't intermittent. They weren't just, you don't have to think of these two countries being in contact just, the time there was the Raumfahrt from the German emperors into Italy to take the crown. It was really a constant balance. But this can be extended, actually, that especially towards the end of the Middle Ages, basically all even the minimal shift in some seigneury in Italy basically changed the whole international political balance literally everywhere in Europe. So this was effectively also the cause why the modern age effectively begins with something called like the Wars of Italy that lasted for 80 years, almost 80 years, and engulfed the whole continent. They started to be fought into Italy, then eventually the battlefields were shifted into Flanders. But that gives you a dimension of how important the system was, and think just, well, it's plenty of elements that have to be taken into consideration here. So the Italian communes, however, are born with this sense of, let's say, of this general aim of self-government of the community. This was the key. Self-government is the key word in here. It's particularly important because we have said that there was an institutional, there was a sense of belonging of these communes to the empire, that they felt to be and they wanted to be protected by the emperor, but at the same time they still owned their own perspective, their own interests, and these were communities that weren't developing, let's say, they were developing namely within the empire, but they were kind of building a very different system on their own, at least under the political, social, and economical point of view, that had its own horizons. You can argue that the Italians even had their own cultural limits in turn, that perhaps were even an advantage when it came to fight against the Germans, because they didn't, even if, yeah, this contraposition really sucks, that there was nothing like in these clashes like Italians versus Germans or vice versa. It was way more complex, as we will say, so forgive me these approximations, but the concept is that they still had their own horizons. Like, these were being born as, I can't say just as fundamentally mercantile republics, definitely had this eye for the gold, for the trade, for these financial activities that developed there first and more quickly than anywhere else. So what really mattered at that point, there's not just a positive intent in this. It's obvious that the Germans had this interest into Italy because it was very wealthy and politically fragmented. So what's best to invade? Like, there was also this universal ideal that the empire had to be reunited. It had to start from Rome, from the Mediterranean. But it was not just an ideal. It was actually a very thorough strategical understanding that has been also criticized, especially if you take the German national historiography of the 19th century. You find that the Hohenstaufen, despite being admired for their achievements, their greatness, etc., were actually also bitterly criticized, because the point was, why didn't you develop a monarchy into Germany? Why did you go after the Mediterranean dream, thinking to recreate the empire from Rome, and invested such a massive amount of resources outside Germany? And this is, by the way, not just a 19th century interpretation. That was the anti-Hohenstaufen political propaganda said already at the time, since the 12th century, when they rose to power. The idea was this inability to stem and to curb fundamentally these Italian communes, and to waste resources for destroying them, when they could build literally entire cities from scratch, like it happened with Milan, that at the time was the largest city in Europe. Frederick Barbarossa storms it, razes it to the ground. The Milanese rebuilt it from scratch, and they keep fighting against it. So it's something incredible. No other place in Europe basically had those potential and capabilities. Just to tell you, even the material dimension of this story. The Middle Ages were largely, as we often say, they are survival rate economical system, right? Those guys in the Italian kingdom had this enormous amounts of resources for those times, and it's obvious that everyone wanted to control that. Even the French, actually, since the second half of the 13th century, so when the French crown had consolidated and expanded and reached the Mediterranean from the north, entered in Italy. As a matter of fact, they seized the Sicilian kingdom that at the time was a Swabian possession, and they start trying to create an hegemonic Angevin, French Angevin system into the peninsula, and it was yet complicated to curb these cities, because, as you understand, as we've just said, one thing was, saying, okay, I have to pass through Italy to get the crown and to go back into Germany. Another thing was trying to say to these cities, now you obey to me, you pay taxes to me, you have all the money to me. And the German cultural limit into this was that they didn't understand the resilience of these systems. They didn't understand that they couldn't ask them to literally give them all they had. Because this is in a nutshell how it happened. I mean, instead of trying to co-opt the elites of the Italic kingdom, what the German emperor simply was to do was to arrive there with iron fist and say, okay, now everything that you basically are used to pay to the commune, now you have to pay to the emperor, because I am the one who... And if you look at it from an institutional point of view, it was actually even a legitimate demand, legalistically speaking. I'm the emperor, I need that money, and you have to give it all to me. And by the way, all this money were, at the time, there wasn't just like a unique, let's say, umbrella under which you could post them under the same name. It was actually a very complicated set of taxes, of contributions, of things that stemmed from the relics of the old feudal, organization that started since the very first emperors into Italy, and that were, I wouldn't say anachronistic, but they were a whole set of elements that the German emperors might have played a bit on, to say, okay, we don't actually ask you everything, because at that point it was literally putting these communes with the shoulders against to put them against a wall, fundamentally, and it was either you give I'll give it all of my money, or I engage into warfare with you, as it happened. So the choice at that point was, what the hell? And if you look at the story, especially with the first, when the whole thing began, actually with Frederick Barbarossa, what you see is that Barbarossa had been called into Italy, aside from the fact that the Romans had kicked out the Pope out of the city, and that was a pretty messy thing to do, also because he needed, the emperor needed, Frederick needed to be crowned there, and by the Pope, by the way. He went into Italy because it was called by the same, some certain communes that actually in Lombardy that were pretty upset about the fact that Milan was overexpanding into the area, and it was basically bullying them. So because obviously at this time everybody was doing literally the same thing. I mean, every single power at this time was doing nothing but bullying their own neighbors and asking for money. This is literally, in a nutshell, the story of the Middle Ages and far beyond, actually, of the whole human history, if you want. And therefore, there were communes that actively called for the emperor, and that tells you how much trust even communes that lived south of the Alps had into the capability of the German monarchy to deal with this problem. And what happened, and it's incredible in this sense, it's amazing, is that when the emperor came and started to cash money, right, the same guys who had called the emperor said, wait a minute, but this is not what we really wanted. At least we hoped that this guy would put a bit would carry out a sort of pacification, try to put the Milanese back in line, and not to make it a racist. And instead, what happened is that they started squeezing these communes like sponges, and they giving out literally everything that they had. So at that point, the point is that even if you study the sources directly, is that the Hohenstaufen screwed it badly. And I tell you that, as probably most of you already know, that I'm a great fan of the Hohenstaufen. Actually, I created a dedicated playlist about them because I was shocked and incredibly upset by finding out that if you Google Hohenstaufen, even on YouTube, etc., you don't find much about them. Like there's a bunch of my videos. So basically, we live in a world where in mass culture people don't know what the Hohenstaufen were and what's their importance and what they did and what all this story is about. And that's shocking to say the least. It's actually insulting. And I don't know how we can have produced this objectively in mass culture. It's embarrassing. I can understand, the masses are on average forgetful about such things, but not at this level where you don't have even a single decent piece of information on it. It's really disgusting. But aside from this, the this episode is very meaningful, as you understand, because it's a story of a general miscalculation, of a pretty massive miscalculation that at that point made European history taking a completely different turn, because all that happened at that point with the German monarchy, the Italian Communes, and in the general balance of European powers, etc., had its was all about these things. There is the scorn, and then obviously lots of other factors, of course, intervened. Dynastic problems. If you go in the playlist about the, it's plenty of videos made about this, about Henry VI, all the problems, the minor age of Frederick II. Think about the Battle of Bouvines. The Battle of Bouvines, it is indeed, and without any sort of debate, the most important battle of the whole Middle Ages. And that's what, for consequences, basically changed. It wasn't actually a massive battle or even tactically is interesting as well, but it changed the face of Europe. So even in there, the fate of Europe was decided in so many ways, but still the general struggle, it was a very intense one between the Hohenstaufen and the Lombard League, was also in the long run to change really the face of the West forever. So when we talk about the origins of the this urban communes, you find that the Italian historians have been naturally in Europe those who studied the most the phenomenon. Even of course, every country kind of studied its own communes, but definitely into Italy this had a much greater proportion. Proportion had a much greater importance, and also in absolute terms, actually, because given the sheer quantities involved, the sheer dimensions involved, and this interest was definitely renewed with the Italian national revival after the Napoleonic Wars, during the period of the so-called Risorgimento, in which these Italian states, their gentry, actually, their bourgeois classes were looking favorably at the idea of creating now a new liberal state, similar to France, actually very much inspired to Napoleonic France. Then it turned out in this constitutional monarchy in the 60s of the 19th century, and they were naturally looking back to the Middle Ages, that were this moment in which it was easy from a national perspective to start claiming what still unfortunately a lot of people think today, that it was like the Italians versus the German invaders, or something like that. It wasn't objectively like that, but this kind of influenced naturally the historiography at the time, and it kind of also expanded outside the Italian boundaries into the historiographies of other countries that were, by the way, reasoning in kind of very similar fashion, because 19th century was century of nationalism, of rise of nations, and all this stuff. And this was read not just in a kind of a national fashion, but also from an institutional profile, because basically the Italian, that's why before I was criticizing the concept of city-state proper, because it's it's too modern, a too modernistic conception for institutions, medieval institutions. It was a kind of a state. As long as you say it's city, it's fine. It wasn't just a city in there. But at least the concept of state is very controversial, also very flexible. What does state really means? There is all a great political philosophy revolving around this, and it's very political theory around this. It's very complicated. But the idea was also that the commune was a sort of modern state in embryo, and it is true, because incidentally I was starting the video just saying this, that it's from communal civilization that the Renaissance is born, that modern Europe is born, and modern states, this idea of naturally this wasn't the case really, at least it wasn't the central thing into the definitely into centuries like the 12th or nor the 13th, right? And definitely the concept of modern state really owes much even to the achievements of communal civilization, but it's not just about that. It's something way more complex, and in general, in my opinion, especially from an ideological point of view, it's just pure modernism to interpret it in this way. We have great difficulties to understand what medieval institutions were really like. These institutions that we're saying were still all imbued with universalism, with corporative ideas, so that the commune was incidentally, overlapping to a city in a certain form of administration, but it was still part of the whole system, right? Together with many other entities, including the feudal ones and these local customs, etc. How medieval society actually was at the time, and kept being actually before up to the 19th century. That is also the thing. The ancien regime, in a nutshell, what was this, even from a strictly juridical point of view, that there wasn't in the Middle Ages a state that enforced the law on the base of a code that went beyond the local prerogatives of various communities. It was, on the contrary, the empire was chosen in order to defend and protect the customs of all the subjects. So that was in theory all it had to do, aside from naturally preserving public order and therefore theoretically pacifying the Christian society, as the empire was conceived like. By the way, there was nothing like a secular idea of the empire. The empire was always, even when it was ideally fighting against the papacy for the struggle of investitures, and also afterwards for other ideological, for the supremacy, etc., but it was still a Christian empire. It couldn't be conceived in any other way, because everything came from divine legitimization, and that was also what those at the law worked like at the time. So we will have to discuss this at one point as well, because it's particularly important to understand how it worked. So this 19th century reinterpretation of the alleged Italian national spirit against the imperial Germanic domination was definitely an historiographical construction with those with that specific context. And I must say, 19th century, this was happening in Germany too, partially. I mean, Germany was developing those theories that I was telling you before about, why didn't the Hohenstaufen think about Germany instead of thinking about Italy? Because in those times, nationalities didn't matter at all. The Hohenstaufen were doing pretty well, actually. They wanted to put the center of their empire in the very center of Mediterranean, in Rome, surrounded by one of the wealthiest, most fertile places in the world, and making of Germany kind of a peripheral province of the empire. It was normal. At that time, that was the goal of everyone. It was the goal of the Byzantines, it was the goal of the Germans, it was the goal of anyone who wanted to come to rule in there, and there was no way out. And even if it wasn't ideological, it was all about the sheer amount of money that crossed Italy and that made this place the wealthiest place in the world per capita. So it was you must want to conquer that. So, but aside from these older perspectives that we have criticized, what happened is that in 20th century historiography has looked back at these things gradually and reacted to it naturally. And this happens for many reasons that I don't have to explain. The anti-national ideas, especially after World War II, this idea of looking at once again to a sort of universal picture, And this reaction came both from Italian and foreign historians, of course, that began to legitimately contest the centrality, the absolute centrality at least, of the communal phenomenon, at least into Italian history, that was the one into which objectively where this occupied a very large space, if an overwhelming large space, but still wasn't all about that. And proposing instead trying to reread fundamentally the events of the 11th and the 12th century in relation with other with things that were happening in the rest of Europe at the same time. For instance, restoring value towards the studying of the countryside, of the seigneurial powers. So this feudal dimension was still largely rural, and that can be barely and approximately interpreted as a kind of a oppositional world to the one of the communes. Relatively to this, there has been a second rejection, however, because it's been pointed out that even this way of interpreting the thing was too radical. Like, there wasn't really the city from one side and the countryside from the other, the commune from one side and feudalism from the other. It was way more complex. I've made at this point dedicated several videos about the genesis of the Italian communes, and stressing how, especially at the beginning, in phase of the so-called consular government, that lasted chiefly throughout all the 12th century, the ruling classes of the communes were effectively aristocratic. They were the military class of the milites, as they were called. They were knights, right? So they were actually the same thing of any other knight in the rest of Europe. And they stemmed, of course, from the feudal nobility of the countryside that in part had come to dwell into the city, to live into the cities. Actually, most of the times across, because still, and this is also another crucial perspective, that if you don't understand, you can't understand the whole thing, is that the city was what it was at this point because of the countryside. The city was not self-sufficient. It needed, of course, grain supplies, etc. It was a very great, a very big deal of political and strategical effort to control the supplying systems, and that even in a country like Italy that relied so heavily and massively on sea trade, on intercontinental trade, still the cities of the Italian kingdom were based, obviously, like any pre-industrial center, on the products of the surrounding countryside. And therefore you realize that even this aristocracy that never quite disappeared, the consular regime phase of the communes is this phase in which the consules, that is the consuls from Latin, at a certain point are overthrown, or at least their power is mitigated by other representatives of the commoners that are growing, because the middle classes are growing fast, especially during the time of the clash between the Empire and the Lombard League. And that's why the battles and the military history in general of those conflicts are so interesting, because you see actually a very fast and impressive rise of infantry warfare into Italy that is even able to achieve pretty consistent results before the general European revival of infantry from the beginning of the 14th century. And the German feudal cavalry was some of kind of the finest arm that you could have at the time. Found out the hard way that the Italian infantries were a very tough nut to crack, and they and the outcome of those conflicts passed even through these relations. So you see how even militarily speaking, political and social factors are so crucial and of radical importance in understanding these processes. And so at a certain point, I don't know what I was saying anymore, but yeah, let's say that this aristocracy at a certain point is kind of weakened by the so-called popolo, which in Italian is the people, literally, and it identified this kind of commoners that are not even in here properly, just like literally the merchant, the artisan, but there were guys, that there were people who maybe had made a freaking lot of money through those crafts and had joined the milites, the knightly class, and had effectively become the same thing. Even indistinguishable. One thing that characterized the Italian militia, the Italian knighthood at this time, especially in Italy, as geographically, narrowly defined as the north and the center, that were all what the communal civilization was about, was based on census, was based on money, was based on blood. It was that as long as you had the money to provide for a war horse, for an armor and stuff, you had to you automatically entered into the militia, and all the other knightly families basically accepted these elements because it was all a matter of clienteles, of corporations, etc. So even in the weakest, in moment of greatest contraction of knightly power into Italy, into these cities, that is roughly the mid 13th century, and even actually second half of the 13th century, what you have is that there are always aristocrats into the city, into the countryside, that live actually in between, because the average thing was to have houses and towers, or house towers, whatever you call it, into the city, and castles in the countryside with a lot of land, etc. So there is even a geographical dimension of this. It's obvious that the most urbanized regions of Italy were the ones in which the people were kind of wealthier, where the classes were largest infantries, the biggest cities. So we're talking chiefly about Lombardy and Tuscany. If you look at the Apennine, the Alps, obviously it's a place where it's more heavily feudal into the process. But even in those most urbanized areas, still the rural nobility rural aristocracy was very important, and it was always playing into the city. And in fact, what happens with the rise of the signories in the 14th century is that effectively it's nothing but a coming back of those same families that had been exiled and that were, however, partially marginated from political life, and that come back because especially the popular regimes are pretty bad at war, especially, and there was a lot of war in the meanwhile, so they absolutely needed these professionists of arms that the feudal militia actually was all about, and that this dimension takes over once again. So you realize how many things, how many levels this thing was developed, and the importance of the seigneurial element is crucial to understand. Even if you look, for instance, at the same time of the struggles of Frederick Barbarossa into Italy, there was the Marquis of Montferrat, for instance. It was one of the noblest and most feudal entities into Italy. Montferrat would be in the western Po Valley, into today's Piedmont. At the time it was Lombardy, actually, because the whole area was known as Lombardy. But this was incidentally a very faithful entity to the emperor, because it also was a feudal entity. And feudal entities generally had this different horizons that contemplated this older patrimonial dimension of castles, of land, of more far-ranging even matrimonial policies, like the feudal aristocracy was much more international um, than the urban aristocracy, for instance. They looked far. They were jealous of their older prerogatives. Of course, the cities had grown kind of at this point. The cities had the upper hand. I mean, they were even later. This dynasties came to rule still from the cities. The city never died out ever in there, but they still belonged to this kind of older world that was even kind of opposite to the city, opposite to the concept of the even of trade of this. I mean, obviously, I'm brutally approximating. Obviously, trade existed everywhere, but that regarded communal civilization, in fact, as communal, of commoners. And if you're an aristocrat, you're of noble birth, and you despise commoners, and that's the same despise and contempt into which the Hohenstaufen and their nobility, the feudal aristocracy that supported them had towards the commoners. And talking about the cultural limits of the Germanic view, it's also, however, interesting to say how the empire learned a lot from this world as well. I mean, Frederick Barbarossa, when he was trying to, he was basically stating his own prerogatives towards the communes, telling them what all that they owed to him as the emperor. He was using jurists from Bologna. He was definitely using, in part, all of these even human, very precious human resources that were being trained and educated into the Italian cities as jurists, as lawyers, as people who were studying, what were reinvigorating at that very time Roman law. And Roman law was extremely craved by the German emperors, because, as you know, in Roman law there is that was effectively the Theodosian Codex of the 4th century, and eventually corrected by just let's say reintegrated, however, by Justinian, was stressing the prerogatives of the emperor of the time, that as a Byzantine emperor, a Roman emperor didn't have. It was the chief of the church, like it was keeping to exist in Constantinople at this time, because and that was crucial in clash for ambassadors, because it was a way to say, look at what the Romans, therefore what we are at this time, because here there is no German. That was the Holy Roman Empire. The average medieval inhabitant was not thinking to be in a German empire or anything like that. It was thinking to be in a Roman empire at all times. The Roman was emperor. It was Constantine had been so. These were the same. That was the historical awareness of this. And actually, it's not just about historical awareness. It's really how the institution was meant to work. It's us we were obsessed by nationalities. Those people weren't. The whole juridical system was also based on this possibility of even switching the national law that you had. You could be judged through several, let's say, ethnic laws still, and that there was this attempt to recover a kind of a more universal dimension, whereas up to that point, even with feudal law that still kept to exist, of course, it was mostly about the local prerogatives and not about a unifying factor, etc. But definitely the clash was lost because of this lack of understanding that all these cities were too big, too resourceful, too materially powerful and morally powerful, especially at that time, to be curbed, and that the only way to make it through that it was to try to reincorporate effectively Italy under the domination of the empire, was to co-opt the local elites as much as possible. And effectively it was done in some way, but at the point where, however, Italy was still split between, those who sided for the emperor, those sided against. Now, the thing, by the way, was not just fault of the of the communes themselves. You have to think at this point, as we were saying, the Pope the French, also the Byzantines, or the were or the were the Aragonese later, they were intervening into the peninsula, backing this or that other faction. So this, combined with the virtually inexhaustible Italian resources, made it a total mess of continuous warfare, continuous troubles that brought this by the way, this region of Europe to actually develop incredibly fast, as wars are not just destructive, but they teach you also how to do a freaking lot of things. If you look at, as we were saying before, at the historiography of Italy during, how Italian chroniclers wrote, like in the 14th century, look at how the Flemish chronicles were. It seems like Flanders were like 100 years back. And so this had triggered a lot of improvements, and it was very chaotic indeed. It was very, but there was a logic in it. What is very fascinating, by the way, is also the generational evolution of this thing, because obviously the communes, and now I won't be repeating myself, you can go to look into the Italian Communes playlist, had all their own evolution, their stages. Now we hinted at incidentally, the consular regimes and the popular regimes, etc. But even the emperors naturally had an evolution. What is very fascinating, in my opinion, is that Frederick Barbarossa, as a Swabian, we're talking about the second half of the 12th century, you have a very particular mindset. I mean, Europe was still very primitive, and even Germany in itself was not all this big development. So, in Germany, feudalism proper arrives just with Frederick Barbarossa. So just think how, feudalism proper in the sense of the French model. Before, it was still kind of not really the old ethnical duchies, but still something reminiscent of that. He enters into this world, and you can that is completely different, south of the Alps, and you can understand in that case that the cultural shock was big. We know from the sources, from the council, etc., that the Germans were amazed to see what was happening to Italy. I mean, they legitimately considered on a legalistic base that things that were happening, like with Milan, were monstrous, were inconceivable, right? So by that generation and all the struggle that for 20 years engulfed the empire with the clashes against the Lombard League, etc., you can understand that. You can understand the cultural gap. You can understand the problem. Even these guys didn't understand each other. We know it from the sources. When the emperor spoke, obviously he spoke in German, and then the thing were translated to the Italians in vice versa, and the thing was pretty messed up, especially when you have to sign an agreement or something like that with all these endless conditions, etc. Everything was very susceptible of interpretation, of trickery and all this stuff. Excuse me, I drank a little bit, etc. But what's very fascinating is that the century afterwards, the grandson of Frederick himself, Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen, son of Henry VI, son of Frederick I, was fighting once again against the Lombard League, actually for the very same reasons. You realize that Frederick II, like Frederick I, it was the man that he was. It was this tough 12th century German knight, very, very bloody, very, square-minded, etc. Frederick II was very different. He was actually raised in Sicily, and he had a completely different mindset. He knew freaking lot about, obviously Italy, Germany, Sicily, even the Muslim world, the Jewry. He had he was an extraordinary mind. He was a completely different person. So, and what is very fascinating in Frederick II is that he had all these different faces that he showed according to whom he had to deal with. Whether it was the Pope, whether it was the Sultan of Egypt, whether it was the German princes, whether it was the Italian communes. And what is interesting about the one he used with Italian Communes is he used the same exact face of his grandfather. In other words, he didn't try to soften them up, to say, okay, I'll buy you. I'll try to make it work with me. Of course, he had his own Ghibelline supporters in Italy, etc. But in the way he dealt with the rebels, from his perspective, with the Guelphs that were fighting against them, still Milan chiefly, but many other cities of the Lombard League, etc. It was absolutely merciless. It was absolutely inflexible. And in fact, the same Ghibellines that were fighting alongside him along these campaigns and looking at these gratuitous butcheries that were done. By the way, also the Guelphs, of course, did that. But the same Ghibellines said, this thing is too harsh. Like, how do you think you're going to convince them if what you do is either you obey or you die? You have to bargain. You have to negotiate here, because here was you don't do. Frederick made massacre. I don't remember when. And the other Ghibellines, the Italian Ghibellines, said, here we're not used to deal like that. And even in there, he didn't make it. He obtained a bunch of victories, then he got defeated once again. Things ended up pretty badly for the Hohenstaufen in many ways in there. But and the idea is that, was there another way? This is actually a very big question. Like, at that point, it's not a matter of saying, well, okay, you have to exterminate them all, because that's what they literally tried to do, and they didn't accomplish that. And I think a wise, balanced historical assessment is that he effectively couldn't. That they couldn't effectively deal like that with that, like that with it in that fashion. So it's a very fascinating chapter, because it's very easy to use the dualism, like, just those Lombards who rebelled and made the mess, and if it wasn't for them, because at that point you have to understand also how the others dealt with them. And the answer is, you can add, by the way, you can add lots of other factors intervening, chiefly the papacy, let's be honest, because as we were saying before, the Guelphs were funded constantly by the papacy, who excommunicated the emperors, who gave money to the Lombard League and all this stuff. But it was also a matter of saying that you couldn't defeat the Pope if you didn't defeat the Lombard League first. After all, especially in the case of Frederick II, but also in the case of Frederick I, actually. But Frederick II was even more problematic, because he was king of Germany and of Sicily at the same time. So what lays in the middle is exactly Italy, as we have defined it, with Lombardy and Tuscany. And the papacy, you understand, if you have this bloc that is against you, even the construction of universal empire is impossible, because you have to connect with these areas of Europe, and it's very complicated. In the case of Frederick II, it was mostly like that as well, if anything, for the fact that Sicily wasn't still German. But the idea is that there was still this thing you had to in the middle, you had to get rid of in a way or another, and it seems that the ways they tried that, weren't really quite effective. And for the rest, even when the Italian Communes won into at Legnano at first, against Frederick I, you realize that at the peace that followed, they didn't quite ask for much. They still granted the emperor some rights that were legitimately the imperial rights, the imperial prerogatives that were owed to the sovereign. But it stopped to that. They wanted their autonomy. They wanted their politicians to be appointed by themselves. They wanted their offices they wanted to be self-governed. That was the point. And for the rest, they had to pay a tax to the emperor, but it ended there. What the Hohenstaufen had done was to force the hand for their own interests. They were definitely, from their side, legitimate in turn, to recreate the empire, to ensure this unity, etc. But they couldn't think realistically that the thing could be dealt simply in that way. And of course, if, I don't know, the Legnano, the Lombard League had lost fundamentally, things might have gone in a very different way. But what happened, first of all, is that they didn't, and secondly, that even if, I don't know, the Barbarossa had achieved another victory in open field, he may have, just continued to have problems as those heirs. Maybe it is that with these dynastic problems that happen, in fact, later. The situation might have reversed as it was before, and therefore turning to ashes all what had been built. And what is interesting is that even certain however, within all this clash, there were still feudal elements that played alongside the emperor, sometimes even against. This is also very, very important. There were certain, there was something even kind of certain noblemen that were born Guelph. They understood that it was well to because of course also the nobility was split between Guelphs and Ghibellines independently from their feudal belonging or not. It is true that the feudal element was more Ghibelline tendentially, but it wasn't like that. For instance, the Romano family that came to be the imperial vicaries in the Adige Valley, that was crucial for the crossing between Germany and Italy, had been born Guelph, and they basically became Ghibellines because Frederick II in that case co-opted them, and that was very clever, for example. So I think this thing should be deepened a lot. There should be many more studies that take into consideration the overall picture, because otherwise it's even difficult to express certain, let's say, certain opinions. So it's obvious that the situation was very much blurred, much more than we can tell. By the way, definitely Italy is an extraordinarily documented place for medieval standards, but still we don't know exactly everything about that either. I mean, sometimes it's difficult even to measure the actual strengths involved into the matter, so it's very difficult to quantify. I mean, what was the actual power? For long times it was believed, for instance, that the armies of Frederick II were enormously powerful. Recent studies show us, even with Manfred, etc., that this power is not even especially that much, chiefly because the Kingdom of Sicily during the interregnum of the Hohenstaufen, at least, let's say, the minor age of Frederick II, had gone in ruin partly, and then now even feudalism there was collapsing, and therefore, everything has to be clearly framed and clearly contextualized from a historical point of view. But what I was trying to say is that, for instance, the Marquis of Montferrat that recurs, for instance, there is a beautiful study. That's mostly about Byzantine history, but it still talks about this international system, etc. A power like the Marquis of Montferrat that I doubt to, this is very famous around, but that's something that was, the Montferrat at that point was all about was controlling the world balance of the situation during the clash with the Lombard League. That was an extremely important Ghibelline entity, and after the Battle of Legnano, they were overwhelmed by the Guelphs. They were obliged to turn Guelph themselves, but even they came back afterwards as Ghibellines, but they had been crucial, for example, for the imperial rule into Italy. There were those key allies that were even these feudal entities were, as we've said, generally in contrast with the cities that were trying to push towards the imperial direction, and therefore in kind of one of the golden era of communal civilization, you still see that there is a feudal element in there, and therefore you say, but this was therefore not just about city-states, nor these were fundamentally just states, because this nobility still influenced heavily the urban life, the communal policy, and so on. So that's how it has to be framed, and especially you can't say anything like, it was like the foreigners arriving in here and no, because interests were pretty transversal, and everybody was doing the same exact thing. That was just to try to emerge as power, and that's pretty much it. So that's how it should be seen. and there isn't much else to, many other ways to see it from perspectively. But it's how it happened that is dramatically complicated to look at, and therefore has to be understood way better than it's usually, and told way better than it's usually done. So yeah, and this was just a very very light introduction that we will definitely have to deepen far, looking at the history of these singular communes, how they developed, what the whole thing was, how even feudal culture informed the same communal institutions, because you don't think that the communal institution was completely devoid of feudal characters at all, actually, especially at the beginning. The consular class, the military class, was all imbued with feudal values and ceremonials that were eventually even adopted, collected by the same popular regimes at one point. That's how cool it is, and especially I hope to expand this also into military history of that time, because it's definitely worthwhile. Whatever. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.